What happens when a world-class black CEO quietly boards a plane and is told by a stranger that she doesn't belong in the seat she paid for? What if she says nothing at first and simply waits? And what if the silence doesn't mean surrender, but something far more powerful? On a routine flight from New York to San Francisco, a confrontation begins not with yelling, but with a simple assumption that presence must be explained, that dignity must be proven. She doesn't shout, she doesn't argue, but something inside her chooses not to move. And that choice will unravel power, expose entitlement, and awaken a plane full of strangers to a truth they can no longer ignore. This isn't just a story about a stolen seat. It's about who we become when silence meets injustice, when institutions watch, and when everyday people finally speak up. So who really had control, and what did it cost to keep it? Get ready to hear a story you won't forget, one that starts quietly and lands somewhere much louder. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your voice helps amplify stories that matter. Now, let's begin. The airport was unusually quiet that morning. A steady hum filled Terminal 4 as passengers moved like murmurs of wind across polished floors. Arielle DuPont walked with a kind of grace that didn't demand attention, but always got it. She wore a navy wrap coat, simple gold studs in her ears, and her hair tucked neatly into a low chignon. Nothing extravagant, nothing loud, and yet every movement whispered authority. She had boarded thousands of flights before boardroom to boardroom, coast to coast. She had sat beside senators and salesmen. She had watched the sun rise from 30,000 feet more times than she could count. But today's flight felt different. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was the weight she carried not in her arms, but somewhere deeper. Her carry-on rolled smoothly beside her as she approached Gate 28. JFK to San Francisco. Flight 728. Ascend air. The gate agent barely looked up, scanning her pass automatically. Arielle smiled softly and thanked her anyway. Small acts of kindness. Always. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the recycled scent of jet fuel and coffee met her like an old friend. She had smelled it for years. It meant movement. It meant purpose. It meant work. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin shimmered in its usual blend of cream leather, muted gold accents, and faux tranquility. Passengers were still trickling in. A businessman in a gray vest fiddled with a tablet. A woman near the window adjusted her sleeping mask before even sitting down. Arielle found her seat, 3C, window seat, quiet side. Perfect. She placed her tote gently in the overhead, careful not to knock the man's coat hanging beside hers. As she sat, she exhaled slowly and sank back into the cool leather. The hum of the plane was oddly soothing. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She thought about the equity conference she had just left in Manhattan. She had spoken on day 2, just after the keynote. Her topic had been silent power leading. When they're not ready for you. The applause had been warm, but not loud. She didn't mind. Quiet recognition had always meant more. As she reached into her bag to retrieve a folder of notes habit, really someone cleared their throat. A soft sound. Sharp. Though. She looked up. A tall man in a charcoal suit stood beside her row. Eyes cool, lips slightly pursed. His gray silk tie was perfectly knotted. Polished Oxfords, groomed like expectation. He looked at her, not directly, more like through her. "You may want to check again," he said, tilting his chin slightly toward her seat. "This is part of my row." Arielle blinked, not startled, just surprised. She looked at her boarding pass. 3C. Printed clearly. She had booked it herself. Weeks ago. I believe I'm in the right place, she said calmly. 3C. His eyes didn't move, but his mouth curled. Just slightly. Well, he said, perhaps the system made a mistake. Arielle tilted her head politely. I've had this seat reserved for a while now. I double-checked this morning, she said, still quiet, still firm. The man didn't move. Look, he said, I need space to lie flat. My doctor said long flights tighten my hips. I usually take the entire row. They know me. Arielle said nothing at first, not because she didn't have words, but because she knew what this was. It wasn't about hips. It wasn't about medicine. It was about being seen in a place he didn't expect her to be. She smiled gently. Then perhaps you should have booked all 3 seats. He exhaled sharply through his nose. You don't have to get defensive, he said, now dropping his coat over the middle seat between them. It's just, I travel like this all the time. You're new to this route. Arielle leaned back. No, I've taken this route more times than I can count. He gave a clipped laugh. Well then, you know how tight it gets. I'm not trying to be difficult. It's just first class should feel like first class. Right. He adjusted his coat to spread more evenly across the seat between them. Arielle didn't touch it, didn't argue. She simply looked out the window. Not because she had lost, but because she knew better. Let him be the one to show everyone who he was. A few moments passed. The cabin doors hadn't closed yet. A few more passengers wandered in, pulling briefcases and handbags behind them. The man sat in 3A now, directly beside her. He opened a leather folio and tapped at a tablet. Occasionally, he looked at her sideways, as if waiting for her to flinch or move. She didn't. Arielle unfolded a copy of The Atlantic and began flipping pages. Her hand was steady, her breathing soft, but inside, she felt that old weight, the one she had carried since her first consulting job at 23, when a partner asked her if she was actually invited to the client meeting, the weight she carried in elevators, in offices, on panels where everyone else wore a different kind of skin. It was the weight of knowing you always had to choose stand up and become angry, stay silent and seem weak, or find the third door, the one no one sees coming. As the captain announced pre-flight procedures, the man beside her pressed his call button. I'd like to speak to someone, he said when the flight attendant arrived. Naomi Wynn, a tall, composed attendant in her early 30s, leaned down with a practiced smile. Yes, sir. This woman, he gestured toward Arielle without looking at her, has taken my row. I need the full space. I've flown with Ascendair for years. Check with someone. Naomi's eyes flickered between them. She glanced at the manifest on her device. Mr. Reese, she said gently, you're assigned 3A. Miss DuPont is assigned 3C. That's what we have confirmed. His nostrils flared, just briefly. Naomi gave a quiet nod and stepped back. Arielle turned a page in her magazine. The plane door closed with a soft finality, but everyone knew something else was just opening. Calder Reese had never flown with someone like her before. At least, not this close, not in what he considered his space. He had traveled first class for years, racking up platinum status, favored passenger tags, and enough perks to insulate him from the discomforts of modern travel. Flight attendants often greeted him by name. Upgrades came without asking. Whiskey was poured before takeoff. But today, something in his usual bubble had shifted. He sat stiffly in seat, 3A, legs crossed, jaw tight. The woman beside him had not only refused to move, She had done so without raising her voice, without pleading, without reacting at all. That unnerved him more than if she had shouted. Who doesn't respond when challenged? He glanced sideways. She was still calmly flipping through a magazine, as if nothing had happened. That subtle smile on her lips made him itch. He shifted in his seat, sighing louder than necessary. Then he tugged at his collar, though the cabin was perfectly cool. Across the aisle, an older couple watched discreetly. They said nothing, but Calder could feel their eyes. He didn't like being observed. He picked up his tablet and swiped aimlessly through news feeds. The screen was full of stories about market volatility, inflation, labor strikes. He ignored them. Instead, his thoughts returned to the woman beside him. What was her name again? DuPont. That's what the flight attendant had said. Miss DuPont. Sounded like old money, but that didn't make sense. He glanced at her shoes, tasteful leather pumps, mid-heel, not flashy, but elegant. She looked like someone important, but didn't announce it. That bothered him. Most people tried to prove their worth in first class. Flashy watches, bragging about destinations. She just existed, fully and unapologetically. That was the problem. Calder leaned his head back and stared at the ceiling. The white paneling above him felt closer than usual. This was supposed to be a smooth flight. No drama, no confrontation. He had a meeting waiting for him in San Francisco, a pitch he'd been rehearsing for weeks. He needed clarity, not distraction. Instead, his mind circled around this seat situation like a moth around a lamp. He looked at her again. She had switched from the magazine to a small leather notebook. She held a fountain pen, the kind you only buy if you've already owned the rest. She wasn't a show-off. She was deliberate. Calder hated how composed she was. He wanted her to react, even just a sigh, a roll of the eyes, something. But she gave him nothing. Arielle DuPont. Who was she? He didn't like not knowing. He tapped the flight attendant call button again. Naomi returned quickly, her expression neutral. Yes, Mr. Reese. He lowered his voice. I'm just curious. Is this woman a public figure or something? Seems like she's drawing a lot of attention. Naomi hesitated. Miss DuPont is a frequent traveler with Ascendair, she said carefully. She prefers to keep a low profile. Calder frowned. That told him nothing and everything. Low profile, but clearly someone. He leaned back again. This time his sigh was quieter, less for show. The truth was, Calder was uncomfortable, and he didn't know how to handle it. He was used to being the dominant presence in any room, not by shouting, not by force, but by assumption. Assumption of place, assumption of status, assumption of who belonged where. And this woman had disrupted all of that without moving a single muscle. He checked the time on his tablet. Still 4.5 hours to go. He didn't like the idea of sitting next to this tension the entire flight. It felt like a mirror he hadn't asked to look into. Across from him, the woman turned a page. He tried not to watch her hands. She wrote something in the notebook. Her fingers were long, elegant. There was a quiet decisiveness in how she moved the pen. She wasn't afraid. He couldn't tell if that irritated him or intrigued him. Maybe both. Calder folded his arms and stared out the window. Rain streaked softly across the oval pane. The city was falling away behind them now, a gray blur against the clouds. He remembered being a kid in upstate New York. Snow boots, yellow buses, the long drive to school past frozen cornfields. His mother used to say, always sit near the front. That's where people listen. He had built his whole life around that principle. Top of his class. captain of the debate team, Harvard Business School, founder of Reese Holdings by 31. His corner office in Manhattan had a view so wide, the clouds looked like ornaments. Yet now, sitting beside this woman, he felt edged out. He hadn't been told to move. He hadn't been insulted. And yet, he felt pushed aside. It made no sense, except that it did. He sighed again. Why did it matter so much? It was just a seat. It was just a person. But that was the lie, wasn't it? For people like Calder, it was never just a seat. It was a symbol, a reinforcement of place, of being seen in the world exactly how he expected to be seen. And right now, this woman, without shouting, without even speaking, was disrupting the entire architecture of that expectation. And it rattled him. For the first time in years, Calder felt small, not because she made him feel that way, but because she didn't have to. Because the truth was, he had built his confidence not just on merit, but on an unspoken system that always favored him. She hadn't moved, and in doing so, she had moved everything. Calder tapped his tablet again, suddenly frustrated by its brightness. He turned it off and set it aside. He rubbed his temples slowly. Beside him, she closed the notebook and placed it gently into her tote. Then, finally, she looked at him. Just one glance. Not angry, not smug, just clear, direct, present. He met her eyes for the first time, and for a brief second, he felt exposed. He blinked, looked away. The cabin lights dimmed for the in-flight movie, but Calder knew he wouldn't be watching anything. He would be sitting in this silence, feeling more watched than ever before. And the flight had only just begun. The cabin had quieted now. Most passengers were settled, tucked under cotton blankets, flipping through touchscreens or scrolling on their phones. A faint scent of roasted almonds floated through the air. Somewhere up front, ice clinked into a glass. But in row 3, the tension hadn't moved an inch. Arielle DuPont remained composed in her seat, legs crossed neatly, hands resting on her lap. She watched the clouds glide past the window, letting herself focus on their soft blur instead of the man beside her. Calder reshifted again. It was his third movement in less than 2 minutes. He reached up, pressed the flight attendant button again. The chime was soft, but distinct. Naomi Wynn returned, calm as ever. Yes, Mr. Reese. He leaned slightly into the aisle, voice low and measured. Look, I don't mean to be a nuisance, but I really do need extra space for this flight. You understand? My hips, my back long-term stuff. I usually stretch out across the row. Naomi nodded politely, though her expression didn't shift. I understand, sir, but I must remind you, this flight is fully booked. Each seat is assigned. Calder smiled thinly. Yes, I heard, but sometimes there are arrangements, exceptions. Maybe the airline could offer this lady. He gestured at Arielle without saying her name. A different accommodation, maybe a seat further back. Arielle turned her head, slowly, with calm precision. Naomi hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Her eyes flicked to Arielle. Miss DuPont, would you be open to changing seats just for Mr. Reese's medical comfort? I understand it's a lot to ask. Arielle held Naomi's gaze, and for a moment, there was only silence. Arielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't sigh. Instead, she spoke with the softness of someone who had carried this conversation for too many years. I'm comfortable right here, she said, and I paid for this seat, just like everyone else. Naomi gave a quiet nod. Of course, she said gently. Then she turned and walked away. But Calder wasn't done. He exhaled sharply and adjusted his cufflink. "I just don't get it," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "It's a matter of decency." Arielle didn't respond. Calder leaned back and let out a humorless laugh. "You know, this is exactly the problem with today's world," he said, now louder. "Everyone's got a chip on their shoulder. Everyone wants to prove something." The passenger across the aisle looked up. The older woman in 4D shifted slightly in her seat. Arielle's heart beat steadily, but her hands remained still. Calder continued, as if explaining a lesson. "I've flown over 2 million miles. I've served on global business councils. People make space for each other. They accommodate. They understand when someone needs a little extra room. But now people get territorial." Still, Arielle said nothing. That silence, to him, was the most offensive part. He took a sip of sparkling water and set the glass down harder than necessary. "I'm not trying to be difficult," he said, "but I shouldn't have to feel boxed in because someone's trying to make a statement." Arielle finally turned to him. Her voice was quiet, deliberate. "What statement do you think I'm making?" Calder hesitated. She looked directly at him. Not in anger, not in fear, just presence. He laughed again, a short, sharp sound. "I'm just saying, look, it's obvious. You're trying to prove something. And maybe this whole performance works in certain circles. But this is a flight, not a protest." For a moment, even the hum of the aircraft seemed to fade. Arielle's gaze didn't waver. She could feel her pulse slow. This wasn't new. This was familiar. This was history knocking at the cabin door in a tailored suit and cufflinks. She turned her body slightly toward him. "No, Mr. Reese, I'm not performing. I'm not protesting. I'm just sitting in the seat I paid for. That's all." Her tone was soft, even, but it carried weight. Enough for the row behind them to pause their conversation. Calder shifted again, this time more agitated. "Well then, congratulations. You've made your point." Arielle turned back to the window. She didn't need to reply. The air around them had shifted. Something inside Calder was unraveling, though he didn't know where to place it. He tapped his tablet again, but didn't look at the screen. His fingers hovered, unsure. He could feel it. The eyes. Passengers now recognized something was happening. The tension had grown too loud to ignore. A younger man in 2B discreetly lowered his phone to his lap, recording without raising it. The couple in 4A whispered. A businessman behind Calder frowned, but said nothing. Calder suddenly snapped his head toward her again. "You know, I've supported diversity initiatives for years. I've hired more than my fair share of minority candidates. I've always said the world needs more strong women. But this entitlement thing, it's getting out of hand." Arielle didn't flinch. She just folded her hands in her lap. That silence again. Calder's voice rose slightly. "It's like, suddenly, it's not enough to be treated fairly. Now you want to dominate every space." The flight attendant returned quietly from the galley, eyes quickly scanning the tension. No words were said, but her presence was felt. Arielle turned slightly. "Is that how you see this?" she asked softly. Her tone was like velvet on steel. "You think this is about domination? Because I won't give up a seat I bought and paid for, in silence, just to preserve your comfort." He opened his mouth but found no words. She continued. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't insulted you. I haven't even touched your coat, even though it's half in my lap." She gently pushed the edge of his coat off the shared armrest. I'm not trying to dominate. I'm trying to exist. And it's hard enough doing that when people like you believe existing in the same space is already too much. Her words settled in the cabin like snow. Slow. Silent. Heavy. Someone whispered. The businessman in 4B nodded slowly. Calder's throat moved as he swallowed. He looked ahead now. Silent. The authority he had worn like a tailored jacket had slipped off without him realizing. Arielle turned back to her window, and finally, she let out a breath. She hadn't planned to speak. She hadn't wanted to. But some things cannot remain unspoken forever. Not when they're this old, this deep. The aircraft bumped softly as it hit a current, but the cabin remained silent, except for the quiet truth that now hung between them. The plane had reached cruising altitude. Outside, the sky was a clean, endless blue. Inside, the atmosphere in row 3 was anything but clear. Calder Reese sat rigid in his seat, arms folded, shoulders high with tension. His lips were pressed into a thin line as though trying to hold something back, but his foot tapped restlessly beneath the seat, betraying a storm behind the calm. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd lost something. Not a seat. Control. And he didn't like it. He looked at the woman next to him, Arielle DuPont. Her name sounded sharp in his head now, like a challenge. She was back to her quiet demeanor, reading again, or maybe pretending to. The magazine hadn't turned pages in several minutes. Calder took a slow breath and sat forward. Then, casually, he leaned his arm across the shared armrest again. He didn't speak right away. He let the motion say what he didn't have the courage to. She moved slightly, reclaiming the space with a subtle shift of her elbow. He exhaled through his nose. This was ridiculous. He turned to her again, voice low. I just think it's a little much. That's all. Arielle glanced at him. Excuse me. He leaned in slightly. Tone, calm, but pointed. This, all of it. You're making a whole situation out of nothing. I asked politely. You could have just helped someone out. Would have been the gracious thing to do. Arielle looked at him carefully. I'm not sure why you think this is about grace, she said. You tried to claim seats that didn't belong to you. You assumed I'd move. And when I didn't, it became a problem. Calder laughed, short and incredulous. I asked because I needed space. It wasn't personal. But your response was, he didn't answer. You looked at me and assumed I didn't belong, she said evenly. That's the part you're not admitting. A beat passed. Then Calder turned away with a smirk. I don't have to explain myself to you. But even as he said it, the words tasted wrong in his mouth. Arielle leaned back in her seat, eyes still on him. I don't need an explanation. I've heard the script before. Calder said nothing. Around them, the other passengers pretended to mind their own business, but the air had grown thick again. Tension now curled beneath every whispered word and sideways glance. A man across the aisle shifted in his seat, clearly listening. Someone 3 rows back coughed, then went quiet. Arielle lowered her gaze to her lap. She wasn't angry, not visibly, but she was tired. Tired in a way that lived deep in her bones, in her history, in the years of pushing through rooms that looked just like this cabin. She'd sat in meetings where she wasn't spoken to. She'd entered elevators where people clutched their bags a little tighter. She'd watched others get credit for the work she had led. And now, here she was, midair, in a seat she had rightfully reserved, still having to prove her place. The absurdity of it pulled at something deep inside her. And yet, she kept her voice soft, because softness had always been her shield. The world didn't grant women like her the luxury of anger without consequence. But inside, the pressure was building. Calder shifted again. "You act like you're some kind of martyr," he muttered. "I just asked for a seat. You're making it about race." Arielle turned her head slowly. "I haven't said a word about race," she said. "But you know what this is." He opened his mouth, then shut it, because deep down, he did know. Naomi passed by, pausing with a kind smile. "Can I get you anything to drink?" she asked. Arielle shook her head. Calder asked for sparkling water, voice clipped. Naomi nodded, disappearing into the galley. Calder looked out the window now, as if hoping the sky might offer an escape. But it didn't. Instead, it offered reflection, and he didn't like what he saw in himself. He tapped the armrest, his frustration now turning inward. He wasn't used to feeling exposed, certainly not by someone who hadn't even raised her voice. He prided himself on being composed, successful, respectable, the kind of man who didn't have problems like this. And yet, here he was, caught in the middle of a confrontation he had started, desperately trying to convince himself he was the victim. The narrative wasn't fitting like it used to. Arielle turned toward the window again. Her reflection stared back at her, calm, collected. But inside, she felt the churn. She remembered what her mentor had told her once. After a long day of being talked over and underestimated, sometimes just staying in the room is resistance. Sometimes the quietest presence speaks the loudest. She had carried that advice into every meeting, every negotiation, every boardroom, and now she carried it into row 3C. Calder reached for his phone, trying to distract himself. He opened a news app. There were reports of protests in Chicago, an article about corporate diversity metrics, a headline about a politician apologizing for a racially insensitive remark. He scoffed and closed the screen. Everything felt political now. Everything felt like a statement, except he had made this into a statement himself. He looked over at Arielle, who had now pulled a small book from her tote. She flipped it open with quiet grace, settling into her seat again. Her presence was steady, immovable, not because she wanted to be difficult, because she had learned she had to be. A younger woman from 3 rows up leaned slightly into the aisle to look at Arielle, then looked away quickly, almost in awe. It was beginning, the shift in perception. The passengers were starting to notice not just what was happening, but how it was happening. Not just the words, but the silences between them. Naomi returned with Calder's drink. Her smile was polite, but tight now. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said. Calder nodded stiffly. Arielle didn't look up. She was done playing defense. She had claimed her space, and whether Calder knew it or not. The balance of the flight had just changed. The aircraft moved gently through the air, thousands of feet above cities and roads and long-forgotten maps of belonging. Inside row 3, a different kind of turbulence had begun. Not in the engines, in the heart, and that kind never triggered an oxygen mask. Arielle hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. She held the book in her lap, its spine warm beneath her fingers, but the words were nothing more than blurred patterns now. The cabin around her buzzed softly, but her mind had drifted to a different place, somewhere much farther back than New York or the clouds outside. The silence between her and Calder was no longer passive. It was alive, a creature with breath and mood and weight. It stretched between them like a heavy curtain, separating more than just 2 seats. She knew this silence well. It was the same one that filled rooms when she walked in and no one expected her to be the boss. The same silence that dropped when she corrected someone in a meeting and they realized she wasn't the assistant. The same silence that had followed her since she first learned, at age 12, that being right and being heard were not the same thing. She had learned to live in it, to master it, to wear it like armor. But today, that silence felt heavier than usual. She stared out the window and watched the slow swirl of clouds, trying to ground herself in something softer. For a moment, she let herself return to a memory. Her mother's hands were in her hair, braiding slow and tight as Arielle sat on the floor in front of her. The smell of coconut oil, the Sunday morning gospel playing low on the kitchen radio. Her mother had told her something that day, something she never forgot. They won't always see you, baby, but you don't stop shining. You walk into every room like the world needs your light. That memory had carried her through college, through years of code switching and playing small to make others comfortable, through the long nights building her startup from scratch, through every smirk, every mispronounced name, every panel where she was introduced last. But the shine took effort, and some days she was tired of carrying it alone. She adjusted in her seat and closed her eyes for a moment. Beside her, Calder was silent now too, but she could feel his tension. It radiated from him like static. He hadn't spoken since their last exchange, hadn't even sipped his drink. He was trapped in the silence too, but for a different reason. For Arielle, silence had always been a proving ground. For Calder, it was unfamiliar territory. He was used to filling rooms with his voice, his presence, used to people stepping aside, deferring, smoothing the path for him. But now, his words had failed him, and the audience wasn't applauding. Arielle's refusal to move, to flinch, to play along with the unwritten script that was something he didn't know how to handle. She felt the tension in his body every time he shifted, the way he tapped his fingers too quickly on his armrest, the way his knee bounced slightly, betraying the calm exterior he was so used to performing. She wasn't angry with him. Not exactly. She was angry at what he represented, at how many times this scene had replayed in her life, in different rooms, with different names, but the same storyline. People like him weren't always cruel, but they were always centered, always expecting the world to arrange itself around them, to soften their landings, to open just enough space for their comfort. And people like her, they were expected to yield, smile, be polite, don't make a scene. Today, she had made a choice not to yield, and now she had to carry that choice like a weight. She opened her notebook and began to write, not because she needed to, but because the motion gave her breath. She wrote one sentence and let it sit on the page. What do I owe silence that it keeps asking for more? She didn't expect an answer. She just needed to let it live somewhere outside her mind. The soft ding of a service cart approaching pulled her back. Naomi was moving through the aisle again, offering snacks, drinks, a brief smile to each row. When she reached theirs, she hesitated. Her eyes flicked between them, aware, careful. Would you like anything? She asked Arielle. Just water. Thank you. Naomi nodded and poured it gently, placing the cup on the tray table. Calder declined. Naomi lingered for a moment. Let me know if you need anything at all, she said. Softer now, more personal. Arielle nodded once, her face unreadable. When Naomi moved on, Calder finally spoke again. His voice was quieter than before. I didn't mean for all this. You know that, right? Arielle looked at him, her face still calm. Didn't mean for what he shrugged. I asked for something. I didn't expect it to turn into this whole thing. Arielle nodded slowly. I know. That's the problem. He blinked. What do you mean? She turned slightly in her seat. You didn't expect consequences, because you're not used to having any. Calder looked down. He had no answer for that. Arielle let the moment breathe. She wasn't trying to teach him a lesson. That wasn't her job. But sometimes, life handed people mirrors. Whether they looked into them or not was their own decision. She took a sip of water and closed her notebook. The silence returned. But it was different now. Less sharp. More reflective. Somewhere overhead, the captain's voice came through the intercom, reporting a tailwind and an early arrival. Passengers murmured softly. The world continued. But in row 3, something had shifted. Calder adjusted his jacket. He didn't speak again for the rest of the hour, and Arielle, for the first time since the plane took off, let herself relax fully into the seat. She had not raised her voice. She had not moved. She had not surrendered her space, and somehow that had been louder than anything she could have said. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight reached its smoothest altitude. The mood across first class had settled into something that felt almost like peace. But in row 3, a quiet current still buzzed beneath the surface. It was the kind of stillness that comes after a storm, the kind that deceives, as if everything has been resolved when really it's just waiting. Calder Reese had gone silent, absorbed in something on his phone, though he hadn't scrolled in minutes. He glanced at Arielle from time to time, but didn't speak. His mind was a loop of fragments, justifications, regrets, questions he couldn't frame aloud. Arielle sat with her hands folded in her lap, calm again, but not relaxed. Her back was still straight. Her eyes occasionally drifted to the window, but she wasn't watching the sky. She was waiting, not for Calder, not for an apology, but for clarity. She had been through enough of these moments to know that the real confrontation never happens in words. It happens in silence, when someone begins to realize that the world isn't going to shift to make them comfortable anymore. The shift began with a voice, young, clear, and unintentionally loud. Wait a second. Is that Arielle DuPont heads turned before anyone could stop them? A young woman in her 20s, seated 2 rows ahead and across the aisle, leaned sideways, peering back at Arielle with wide, curious eyes. It is. Oh my God. You're her. Right from Ascendair. You're the CEO. I watched your TED Talk in my business ethics class. The cabin's energy flipped like a switch. Calder's head snapped toward Arielle, confusion crashing across his face. Several passengers lifted their heads at once. Some turned around fully in their seats. Arielle didn't respond immediately. She offered the young woman a small smile, polite and composed. Yes, that's me. The words were quiet, but they filled the space like a ripple through water. The young woman beamed. Wow. I didn't expect sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just admire your work so much. The way you talk about leadership and fairness and internal culture, it's so powerful. Thank you, Arielle said gently, but the focus in the cabin had already shifted. The businessman in 2A murmured something under his breath. A woman near the bulkhead leaned toward her partner and whispered. Calder sat frozen. CEO. He blinked as if hearing the letters for the first time. Arielle DuPont. He had heard the name, of course. The media often covered her when talking about modern executive leadership. She had been profiled by Forbes, featured in Bloomberg, once even listed among the top 20 most influential women in corporate America. And she ran Ascendair. The very airline he was sitting on. Her airline. His stomach sank with a slow, dreadful pull. The CEO of this airline? Sitting quietly beside him while he tried to force her out of her seat. He swallowed hard. She hadn't said a word. Not about her title. Not about her authority. She had let him talk. Let him embarrass himself. Let him show everyone exactly who he was. Arielle returned to her posture, the same one she had held for most of the flight. Serene, present, unmoved. Calder felt like the air had been drained from his lungs. He looked around and saw how others were now watching him, not just curious, but knowing. Their expressions had shifted. The story had changed, and he was no longer its narrator. He looked back at Arielle, desperate to find something in her face. Anger, smugness, disdain. But there was nothing like that. Just stillness. Just dignity. And that stung worse than any insult. Naomi appeared again. Slower this time. She looked at Arielle with something close to admiration. Her voice was soft. "Miss DuPont, can I offer you anything else? We have chamomile, green, Earl Grey." Arielle smiled with grace. "Chamomile would be lovely." "Thank you." Naomi nodded, left, then returned with a porcelain cup cradled in her hands like a small offering. She placed it gently on Arielle's tray table, her eyes flicking briefly to Calder before she turned away. No words were exchanged between them. None were needed. Calder tried to reset the moment, tried to salvage something. He turned slightly toward Arielle and lowered his voice. "I didn't know who you were." She didn't look at him. "That's the point." He blinked again. "What do you mean? I mean it shouldn't matter. Who I am. What my title is. Whether I'm the CEO or just a passenger. I should be able to sit here without being questioned or pushed or treated like I don't belong." Her tone was calm, but unshakably firm. He looked away. I didn't mean she stopped him with a glance. You don't have to mean harm to cause it. He sat back, stunned by the quiet clarity of her words. It wasn't just what she said. It was how she carried it, like someone who had spent a lifetime waiting for people to hear what they didn't want to listen to. Across the aisle, someone shifted again. Whispers had resumed, quiet but intense. Phones had been silenced, but cameras were still, perhaps recording. Calder felt like he was shrinking, like the expensive suit he wore no longer fit quite right. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had always felt secure in rooms. His voice had always been the anchor in meetings, the closing pitch in negotiations. But this silence was swallowing him whole. He tried one more time, reaching for something. For what it's worth, I really do have a hip issue. I wasn't lying. Arielle looked at him then. "I believe you. But you used your discomfort as a license to push someone else out. That's not pain. That's privilege." He had no reply. The woman in 2D looked over at Arielle with a small nod. A middle-aged man in a window seat quietly adjusted his phone. The power in the room had shifted, and Arielle hadn't moved an inch. She picked up the cup of tea and held it in both hands. It was warm, soothing. She took a slow sip, then exhaled. For the first time since the wheels left the ground, she felt her breath return to its natural rhythm. Not because Calder had apologized. He hadn't. Not because the cabin had rallied behind her. They hadn't spoken. But because truth, once named, didn't need approval to stand. The woman across the aisle leaned in again. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that. I don't think any of us realized." Arielle met her eyes. "That's usually how it works." She returned her gaze to the window. The sun had begun to tilt westward, casting soft gold against the clouds. The light touched her face gently, as if in quiet solidarity. Behind her, Calder sat motionless, staring straight ahead, no longer sure where he belonged in this space. And above them all, the plane soared forward, carrying more than just passengers. It carried reckoning. Arielle placed the teacup gently back onto the tray table, her fingers resting against the warm ceramic for a moment longer than necessary. She could feel the shift in the cabin, the weight of too many eyes now floating in her direction. Some curious, some sympathetic, a few confused, but most of all, uncertain. The kind of uncertainty that comes when a mirror appears mid-air and no one is sure what they're actually seeing in it. She closed her notebook softly, slid it into her tote, and retrieved her phone. She wasn't checking the time. She wasn't scrolling. She opened a secured internal app known only to a handful of executives within Ascendair, a protocol designed for rare situations where the airline's integrity or passenger safety might be compromised not by danger in the air, but by something much more difficult to name: bias, hostility, discrimination that needed no weapons to cause harm. The screen glowed in her palm, muted by the soft light above. A prompt appeared: Activate Operation Groundwire. Arielle hesitated for a beat. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't retaliation. It was reinforcement. She tapped once. The screen confirmed. Silent activation successful. Groundwire had begun. In the front galley. Naomi's device buzzed quietly in her apron. She glanced down, her eyes sharpening instantly. No alert tone. Just a color-coded bar glowing soft gold. She tapped it open. One word appeared in bold type. Observe. Naomi raised her eyes slowly. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Shoulders lifted, spine straighter. She turned toward the cabin with new awareness. In the back galley, Javier Moore, the lead flight attendant, received the same signal. He closed the storage drawer, locked it, and stepped out toward the aisle. Calm, measured steps. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't need to. Groundwire wasn't a protocol of escalation. It was designed for containment. Discrete adjustments were triggered within the network. Calder's device, previously connected to the onboard Wi-Fi, now flashed a single message across his screen. Connection interrupted. Please wait to reconnect. He frowned, tapped again, then harder. No signal. He toggled airplane mode on and off. Irritated. Still nothing. He tried to reload his email. Error. He checked his calendar. Blank. He refreshed. Still blank. A low frustration started to build. He muttered to himself, then looked at the upper bulkhead as if expecting answers to fall from the ceiling. Arielle remained silent. She knew what was happening. Groundwire worked by isolating digital access not to punish, but to neutralize. No emails, no texts, no streaming distractions. The flow of external validation halted. It was a tactic developed in response to past incidents where influential passengers used connectivity as a weapon. Threats to staff, social media manipulation, mid-flight, legal intimidation. Not this time. This time, the silence was not her burden. It was his. Calder shifted again, more visibly agitated now. Naomi passed by casually, glanced at his screen, then at him. Is everything all right, Mr. Reese? The tone was polite, but it had an edge now. Not harsh, but definite, unyielding in its boundary. He exhaled sharply. The Wi-Fi just cut out. I need to connect. She nodded. We're experiencing a temporary bandwidth limitation. Should be resolved after cruising. Calder stared at her. That's not acceptable. I have time-sensitive calls. Her face remained perfectly still. I'm sure it's frustrating, sir. But at the moment, it's system-wide. He didn't reply. He looked down again at his screen, then up at the seatbelt sign, then sideways toward Arielle. She was reading once more. A new book now. A hardcover, worn slightly at the edges, its spine clearly loved. Her hands turned the pages slowly, deliberately, with the kind of ease that came from having nothing to prove. That quiet again, but this time, it wasn't hers. It was his. And it was deafening. In the crew area, Javier monitored the cockpit status screen. He wasn't watching for turbulence or mechanical issues. He was watching for any signal of escalation, any shift in passenger behavior. The app updated again. Ground wire phase 2. Hold. They would not interfere unless necessary. Arielle had sent her message. The system had listened. Calder leaned forward and tapped the call button once more. This time, Javier approached. He wasn't smiling. Sir, how can I assist? Calder hesitated. It's the Wi-Fi. I need to make contact with my office. This is critical. Javier nodded once. Sir, your access has been paused for the duration of the flight. Calder narrowed his eyes, paused. On whose authority? Javier didn't blink. I'm not at liberty to disclose that. Calder's voice rose half a note. That's absurd. I am a priority customer. I'm eligible for uninterrupted access. This is ridiculous. Javier stood straighter. Our job is to ensure a peaceful cabin experience. Your access has been disabled for that purpose. If you continue to disrupt, we may have to escalate. Calder stared at him. You're threatening me. No, sir. We are protecting our crew and passengers. Javier turned and walked away before any more could be said. The silence around row 3 had become a vacuum now, a quiet pressure. Arielle didn't look up. She didn't need to. This wasn't about showmanship. It was about system shift. In her mind, she thought of the dozens of times she had been told to ignore, to forgive, to be bigger than the moment. And she had done so, over and over again. But leadership didn't always mean swallowing discomfort to keep peace. Sometimes it meant building a structure that protected peace from being broken in the first place. Groundwire had not embarrassed Calder. It had simply denied him the tools he had always relied on. Connectivity, access, control. Now he sat in his seat, isolated, disoriented. For the first time in a long time, his name carried no weight. His usual tactics had no reach. And that silence, the one he thought he owned, was finally his to carry. Arielle flipped another page. The page made no sound, but the message echoed. There is power in restraint, power in knowing when to speak and when to act, and more power still in designing a system that doesn't need volume to demand justice. The plane continued west, soft and steady, outside the window. The sun glowed like a promise. Arielle sat with her book in her hands and a calm in her chest she hadn't felt in hours. She had not stood up. She had not raised her voice. But something had moved, and for the first time, it wasn't her. It was the world around her learning to shift. The cabin had gone quiet again, but this time the silence didn't feel elegant or relaxed. It felt charged, heavy with something volatile and unspoken, like static building before lightning. Calder Reese sat stiffly in seat 3A, his jaw clenched, eyes darting across the cabin. The usual self-assurance in his posture had begun to crumble, replaced by something tight and restless. He tapped his fingers against the tray table rhythmically, his breath short and uneven. He couldn't connect, couldn't access anything, couldn't reach his assistant, his office, his legal team. The screen on his phone stared back at him blankly, mocking him. Every attempt he made to refresh, to reload, was met with silence. Not even an error message now. Just a void. He was cut off, and it terrified him. Next to him, Arielle DuPont hadn't spoken a word. She didn't need to. Her calm presence, her unreadable expression, was more unsettling than any confrontation. She hadn't moved, hadn't flexed her status, hadn't told a single person who she was, and somehow she had turned the world around him upside down. He could feel the eyes now, the subtle glances from the row behind, the passengers who had seen the earlier exchange, the young woman who had recognized Arielle's face and lit the match that exposed it all. Calder swallowed hard. He was unraveling, but pride wouldn't let him admit it. So he chose anger. He stood up. The sudden motion startled nearby passengers. The woman across the aisle looked up with wide eyes. The flight attendant in the front galley stiffened and stepped forward immediately. "Sir, please return to your seat," Naomi said with calm professionalism. Calder raised his voice. "No, I want answers. Right now." He looked around the cabin, hands slightly raised, as if appealing to a jury that didn't yet realize it was on trial. "I paid for this seat. I have rights. I demand to know why I'm being treated like this." Arielle didn't move. Naomi approached slowly, standing directly in front of him. "Mr. Reese, we're mid-flight. For your safety and the comfort of everyone on board, I need you to remain seated." Calder's voice sharpened. "Don't talk to me like I'm a child. I've flown this airline for years. I know how things work. This is targeted. I know it." Javier Moore appeared beside Naomi now, tall and steady, arms crossed. "Sir, we need you to lower your voice. You need me to lower my voice. You've cut my connection, refused service, humiliated me in front of a cabin full of people. And for what? Because I asked for some space." His voice cracked near the end. It wasn't power anymore. It was panic. Passengers began whispering. One man across the aisle quietly lifted his phone, the camera blinking to life. Naomi didn't move. Neither did Javier. Arielle turned her head now, just slightly, her eyes meeting Calder's for the first time since he'd stood up. Her voice was soft, controlled. "Mr. Reese, sit down." He glared at her. "You don't get to tell me what to do. I'm not telling you as CEO. I'm asking as a fellow passenger. Sit down before you embarrass yourself any further." The finality in her tone hit like a stone dropped into still water. There was no anger in her voice, only a kind of weary certainty. Calder hesitated. Then something inside him snapped. He pointed a shaking finger at her. "You set this up. All of it. You think you're some kind of hero sitting there, watching me fall apart. You think this makes you better than me." Arielle didn't answer. Her silence now wasn't strategic. It was protective. She had seen this unraveling before. The way ego, when cornered, lashes out like a wounded animal. She wasn't here to absorb it. Naomi stepped forward again, firmer now. "Mr. Reese, this is your final warning. If you do not take your seat, we will initiate a report to federal authorities upon landing. We are prepared to remove you from future flights pending review." Calder's breathing quickened. His hand tightened around the back of his seat. He looked around the cabin, seeking validation, but found only silence. Stares, disapproval. No one came to his defense. Not a single voice echoed his. He had become the very thing he feared most, isolated, powerless, Exposed? His shoulders slumped slightly. He sat down. The motion was jerky. He fumbled with the seatbelt, clicked it closed too fast. For a few seconds, he didn't look up. Arielle turned away, back to her book. The moment had passed, but the tremble of it still lingered in the air. Naomi nodded at Javier. Both returned to their stations slowly, keeping eyes discreetly on the row. The whispers began again, more confident now. Some passengers murmured about the footage being recorded, others about Arielle, about who she was and how she'd handled the confrontation. But Arielle didn't listen. She had heard it all before. The praise that followed survival, the applause for grace under pressure, the admiration that arrived too late. She closed her book and stared at the tray table for a moment, her reflection faint in the plastic. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something closer to grief. Grief for how common this still was. Grief for how much energy it cost to simply claim your space. Grief that even now, with the systems she had helped build, she still had to use them not for progress, but for protection. Calder stared out the window now, but he wasn't seeing anything. His mind raced with rehearsed statements, with imagined comebacks, with justifications he could offer the press if this ever became public. But he knew the truth. The damage was already done, not by Arielle, by him. He had revealed himself, stripped bare of entitlement and grace, in front of an audience that would not forget. And in that realization, he felt something unfamiliar. Shame. A deep, suffocating shame that burned more than any reprimand. Arielle inhaled slowly, then closed her eyes. For now, it was enough to breathe. It was enough to have stayed seated, to have refused to yield, not by force, but by being. That kind of presence could not be stolen, and it could not be broken by fury. The cabin was quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of hush that came after a storm, where no one knew if another wave would rise or if calm had finally arrived. Calder sat rigid in his seat, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the darkening clouds beyond the window. His posture screamed defiance, but his body betrayed him. There was a tremor in his jaw, a twitch in his fingers. The mask of power was cracking. Arielle DuPont sat a row behind him, eyes lowered, hands resting calmly in her lap. She hadn't spoken since asking him to sit. She hadn't needed to. Her stillness was a mirror now, reflecting everything back at him. People had watched long enough, and then it began. From the middle of the cabin, a woman in her 60s spoke, her voice quiet but crisp. "Excuse me, I just want to say something." Heads turned. Even Calder flinched slightly. She stood. Her name was Barbara Wilkins, a retired school principal from Detroit, wearing a cardigan the color of worn brick and glasses that slid down her nose. "That woman has been nothing but calm and respectful," Barbara said, gesturing gently toward Arielle. "And I've seen how she's been treated since the beginning of this flight. It's not right. It's not decent." The words weren't loud, but they landed heavy. The man across from her nodded and stood as well. "She's right. I was watching too." He kept pushing, kept taking more space than was his, and when he got called out, he made himself the victim. Calder shifted in his seat. A younger passenger behind them, maybe in her early 20s, lifted her voice. "I recorded it. I saw everything. You don't get to bully someone and then cry foul when people call you on it." She wasn't speaking to Calder. She was speaking to everyone now, and others joined. An older gentleman in a pressed navy suit, silent until now, spoke next. We've all been quiet for too long. This sort of behavior only continues because too many of us say nothing. But not today. Calder turned, startled, his eyes darting from face to face. People he had assumed would remain neutral were rising, slowly, steadily, one by one. Passengers were reclaiming the space he'd tried to dominate. No one raised their voice. No one yelled. Their power came from the simplicity of truth. A middle-aged black man in a crisp sweater vest stepped into the aisle. I flew in the military for 22 years. I've seen leadership under fire. What she showed back there. That's real strength. That's composure. That's grace. What you showed, sir, was entitlement. And the fact that you don't see it doesn't make it any less true. Calder opened his mouth, then closed it. He had spent his entire career projecting certainty, that his wealth and reputation would protect him. But now, he sat surrounded by strangers, and not one of them looked at him with reverence or admiration. They looked at him with disappointment. Arielle remained seated. She hadn't asked for this. She didn't want revenge or humiliation, but she didn't stop it either, because silence had protected too many for too long. From the rear galley, Naomi Wynn stood watching, her eyes glossy with emotion. It was rare, so rare, to see a plane full of people speak up like this. Usually, they avoided eye contact, turned up their headphones, acted like they hadn't seen a thing. But something about this moment had changed the equation. It wasn't just about a stolen seat or a man refusing to move. It was about what people were no longer willing to accept. Naomi stepped into the aisle and looked directly at Arielle. "Miss DuPont, would you like some tea or water?" The offer wasn't just about refreshments. It was an offering of respect. Arielle looked up, her expression softening. "Water, please. Thank you." Naomi nodded and walked off to fetch it. Calder pressed his hand to his forehead. His thoughts raced. Out of control. This couldn't be happening. He was Calder Reese. He had spoken on global panels, sat on corporate boards, been featured in Forbes. He was not someone people turned on. And yet, here he was, sinking in silence while another woman, one he had tried to diminish, rose with every passing second. The video. That girl said she recorded it. His heart pounded. His name. His face. If this got out, it wouldn't just be a viral moment. It would be his undoing. He looked back, eyes desperate now. "Let's not make this bigger than it is," he said to no one in particular. "We've all had moments where we were misunderstood." Arielle didn't turn. The cabin didn't respond. Even now, he was trying to downplay it, trying to rewrite the narrative, but the story had already taken on a life of its own. Naomi returned with the water, handing it to Arielle like it was sacred. "Thank you," Arielle said, her voice kind but distant. Naomi smiled and walked away. She didn't even glance at Calder. That, too, was its own verdict. Javier Moore walked slowly down the aisle, checking on passengers. "Everyone all right?" he asked, voice low but steady. Heads nodded, soft replies of, "Yes, thank you," or "We're good" followed. But the atmosphere had shifted. Arielle felt it, the slow, tectonic movement of conscience. She didn't need a headline. She didn't need applause. She needed this. The moment when people who had stayed silent finally realized their silence was part of the harm. The moment when complicity broke. She glanced out the window at the soft gradient of blue meeting dusk. Somewhere down there, the world churned on, full of the same biases and burdens that had just played out in row 3. But here, in this suspended sky, something had shifted. It wouldn't fix everything, but it mattered. A soft chime rang overhead as the captain's voice returned, offering weather updates and expected arrival times. People leaned back in their seats. A few whispered to one another. Others looked contemplatively at their hands, their phones, their neighbors. Calder remained silent. The rage inside him hadn't gone, but now he knew he was no longer in control of the narrative. The story had moved on, and it wasn't his to shape anymore. It belonged to every person in that cabin who had chosen to speak up, to Arielle, who had refused to flinch, to the quiet power of truth, and to the future, waiting patiently on the ground below, ready to ask what each of them would do next. A strange stillness had fallen over the first-class cabin, not one of emptiness, but of waiting. It was as if the entire aircraft was holding its breath, suspended in a moment that felt bigger than anything a normal flight should contain. Arielle DuPont sat quietly, her hands resting on the armrest, the plastic cup of water untouched beside her. She looked calm, but inside her, a quiet tide of emotion was rising. Not rage, not triumph. Something deeper, a mixture of weariness and unwavering strength. She had endured this sort of thing before, just never this publicly. From the other side of the cabin, Calder Reese stared blankly out the window. He looked smaller now, somehow reduced in stature. His tailored suit still pristine, his watch still gleaming under the soft LED lights, and yet all of it looked hollow. He had power, but for once, no one seemed interested in obeying it. Near the front galley, Naomi Wynn glanced at her watch, then back toward the curtain behind her. The text she'd received 10 minutes ago still sat unread on her screen. It had come from someone unexpected. Skylinks Airlines Vice President of Customer Integrity was on board. They hadn't announced it to the crew beforehand. Apparently, he had boarded late, under a confidential observation initiative designed to assess in-flight culture firsthand. The program was called Elevate, a direct initiative of the CEO. The VP's name was Sterling Ray, and he had seen everything. Naomi stepped quietly into the private galley and found him already waiting. He stood tall, with silver at his temples and a calm, almost judicial expression. Not the kind of man who rushed to speak. Not the kind to bluff. He didn't ask Naomi anything at first. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. Was it all recorded? Naomi nodded. Some passengers were filming, and I kept my own log. Sterling Ray didn't flinch. His eyes held a depth that came only from years of watching systems fail people who did not look like him. He had seen too many moments like this play out behind closed doors, brushed aside in reports or sanitized by corporate PR, but not this time. He stepped out from the galley into the aisle. The cabin quieted as he walked forward. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. There was something about his presence measured, dignified, final, that drew attention like gravity. He stopped next to Calder's seat. "Mr. Reese." Calder turned, startled. He blinked a few times, then shifted into performance mode, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes." "Can I help you?" Sterling remained calm. "You already have, but now I believe it's time for a different kind of conversation." Calder's smile faltered. He could tell this man wasn't another flight attendant or passenger trying to maintain decorum. There was steel behind his words, and behind that, consequence. Sterling looked at Arielle. "Miss DuPont, I want to sincerely apologize for what you've been put through on this flight. I've observed the entire situation, and I want you to know we take this extremely seriously." Arielle nodded slowly. She appreciated the formality, but also sensed something deeper behind his words, a genuine respect. Sterling turned back to Calder. "Sir, I have reviewed the footage, including several live feeds from our onboard cabin system and passenger recordings. Your conduct toward Miss DuPont has been inappropriate, discriminatory, and in violation of both company policy and federal flight conduct standards." Calder opened his mouth as if to argue, but Sterling gently raised a hand. "I wouldn't recommend continuing down that path. Mr. Reese, at this point, your best course of action is to listen." Around the cabin, heads had begun to turn. Phones were out again, but more discreetly this time. The passengers knew they were watching something rare, a reversal of power, delivered not in shouting or threats, but in precision and composure. Sterling reached into his coat and handed Naomi a sealed document. "This is an incident protocol form. Please mark the following Category A discrimination: Passenger Code 471B abuse of seat rights, verbal intimidation, and disruption of flight integrity." Naomi nodded. Her pen shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of finally seeing someone stand up from within the system itself. Sterling turned to the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand this is highly unusual, but please know we are committed to ensuring every customer is treated with equal dignity. Today you've witnessed something that must never be normalized, and we will be addressing it with transparency." The passengers didn't cheer. They didn't clap. But the silence that followed was louder than any ovation. Arielle looked at Sterling, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she said quietly, "not for the apology, for being willing to stand in front of it." Sterling bowed his head slightly. "You shouldn't have had to carry this moment alone." Calder stared at him in disbelief. He looked around for some source of rescue, perhaps a powerful passenger to come to his defense, someone with equal rank to Sterling, but there was no one left. Even the flight crew avoided his gaze now. The influence he had wielded like a weapon for so long had dissolved in the face of collective conscience. He swallowed hard. "I was just trying to rest. That was all." Sterling didn't raise his voice. "Sir, there is a difference between resting and disrespecting. You crossed that line. Repeatedly. We've documented everything. When this flight lands, you will be escorted for further debriefing. I also recommend preparing for a formal review from the ethics committee at your company. I believe some of your investors will want clarification as well." Calder froze. That last sentence landed like a brick. His company, his board, the people who had always protected him when headlines grew inconvenient. He could already see it, his name on the news scroll, emails from public relations, and the knowing silence of colleagues who had long waited for someone to hold him accountable. Sterling didn't linger. He turned back to Naomi. "Please inform the captain that the situation has been stabilized. We'll be submitting our initial report before landing." "Yes, sir." Naomi watched him disappear behind the galley curtain again, his stride unhurried, like someone who knew exactly what justice looked like and how to walk in it. Back in her seat, Arielle let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hand moved gently toward her tote, fingers grazing the edges of her folded boarding pass. It was still there. Seat 3A, her name printed clearly in black ink. Proof that she belonged, that she had always belonged, and that now, finally, the world around her was beginning to say so too. The cabin lights brightened slightly as the captain's voice returned overhead, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into San Francisco. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are returned to their upright position. Flight attendants will be coming through to prepare the cabin for landing." The announcement washed over the cabin like the tolling of a distant bell. It was almost over. The flight. Yes, but not the story, not the shift, not the reckoning. Arielle DuPont stared out her window as the first outlines of the bay began to form through the clouds. The sun was beginning to drop behind the horizon, casting the landscape in hues of soft gold and amber. It was a gentle, forgiving light, the kind that made even concrete glisten like something alive. She closed her eyes for a moment. The weight of the past few hours pressed against her ribs like a quiet ache. She had remained composed, but that composure had come at a cost. The restraint, the deep breathing, the way she had to steady her own hands under the tray table, the pauses between each sentence. None of it had been easy, and still, she was expected to carry it all with elegance. No public anger, no raised voice, just grace, even when being diminished, even when being recorded, even when being tested. But now, as the plane descended, something shifted in her chest, a kind of calm that wasn't about control anymore. It was about ownership, of her story, of her strength, of her place. Naomi moved quietly through the cabin, checking seat belts and gently reminding passengers to stow their belongings. Her face still held a softness, but it had been sharpened with purpose since that moment with Sterling Ray. She paused when she reached Arielle. "Thank you, Miss DuPont, for everything." Arielle opened her eyes, met hers. "Thank you, Naomi. You stood firm." Naomi smiled. It was small, but filled with understanding. Then she moved on, her hands lightly adjusting the shoulder strap of a man's carry-on without being asked. Across the aisle, Calder Reese was still staring out the window, but now his reflection was all he could see. The skyline he once admired on so many previous flights now felt like a judgment. He wasn't thinking about business meetings anymore, or the conference waiting for him in downtown San Francisco. He was thinking about what would be waiting for him when that cabin door opened. He had tried to explain himself earlier, had searched for the right words to reframe what had happened, to regain his dignity, but each attempt died on his tongue. He wasn't the victim in this narrative, and the worst part was he had known better. Somewhere deep inside, beneath all his excuses and corporate polish, he had known he was crossing a line when he asked her to move. He had known it when he insisted, when he used his discomfort as leverage, when he raised his voice to mask his fear of being irrelevant. Now he would have to live with that truth. He reached down to his phone again, hoping maybe the connection had returned. Still nothing. Naomi approached him next. "Please stow your electronics, sir. We're preparing for landing." He nodded silently, turned the phone face down on the tray. The plane tilted slightly as it lined up with the runway. A few passengers began gathering their personal items, even though the seatbelt sign was still on. One older woman in the back row dabbed her eyes with a tissue. She wasn't crying for herself. She was crying because something about the last few hours had pierced her, made her rethink 1,000 moments where she had said nothing, laughed nervously, let things slide, and now she felt it, the sharp edge of complicity. Arielle sat still, watching the clouds part and the city grow closer. The familiar skyline appeared: the Transamerica Pyramid, the golden thread of the Bay Bridge. She had flown into this city countless times, but this arrival felt different. She wasn't just coming home. She was landing as someone who had demanded space and kept it. Sterling Ray stepped out briefly from the galley again and made a subtle nod toward Naomi. The protocol was ready. The report had been filed. The local liaison for Ascendair's ethics division would be waiting at the gate. This wasn't going to disappear into paperwork. This was going to be addressed. For real. The wheels touched down with a soft screech against the runway, the kind that made passengers look up briefly before settling back again. The city slid past the windows. The plane slowed, gradually easing toward the terminal. Arielle felt her heart slow too. She wasn't anxious about what came next. She had been through worse. And now, for the first time, she wasn't alone in remembering what happened. She glanced around the cabin. The passengers who had once been silent now held a kind of collective quiet. The kind that came from watching something important, something they couldn't unsee. It wasn't just about Arielle. It was about every person who had ever been asked to shrink, about every person who had been told, politely, that they didn't quite fit the space they were in, and about the courage it took not to argue, but to remain, to stay seated. The seatbelt sign dinged off. People rose, slowly, stretching limbs, adjusting jackets, pulling bags from overhead compartments. The usual chaos of landing was present, but muted, as if no one wanted to speak too loudly, as if the cabin had become sacred ground. Arielle remained seated. She always waited until the crowd thinned anyway. Calder remained seated too, though for a very different reason. He didn't want to walk through that aisle, didn't want to pass the rows of people who had seen him at his worst. But the moment wouldn't wait. 2 uniformed personnel entered the plane quietly from the front, flanked by a representative in a dark suit holding a clipboard. They walked directly to Calder's seat. "Mr. Reese, we'd like a word with you in the terminal." Calder said nothing. He stood slowly, picked up his briefcase, and followed them down the aisle. No applause, no condemnation, just silence. Arielle finally stood, reaching for her coat and tote bag. Naomi waited beside her. "He'll be processed properly," Naomi said gently. "We'll make sure this doesn't disappear." Arielle nodded. "I believe you." They walked off the plane together, stepping into the tunnel as the air shifted from recycled to real. The gate bustled with energy, none of it aware of the storm that had just passed overhead. Sterling Ray stood to the side, nodding at Arielle as she passed. "Welcome home, Miss DuPont." She smiled at him. "Thank you for standing in it with me." "Always," he said. "It's time we stop asking you to stand alone." Arielle stepped forward into the terminal. She didn't look back, because what she had carried had already landed. And the truth unspoken for too long had touched down with it. The press didn't find out for another 12 hours. By the time the first blurry footage began to circulate captured by a college student in row 5, the narrative had already begun to take shape on its own. It wasn't the kind of story meant to go viral. Not a shouting match. Not fists or fights or dramatics. It was something quieter. A long, uncomfortable silence broken only by dignity. The headline that began circulating online read "Black Woman CEO's Seat Stolen by White Passenger Seconds Later. Flight is grounded." But the truth was more layered than that. The flight wasn't grounded because of noise. It was grounded by presence. By Arielle DuPont choosing to stay seated when every social cue told her to move. It was grounded by a crew that paid attention, by witnesses who found their voices, and by a system one she helped build that finally responded the way it should. The next morning, Arielle sat on the edge of her bed in her quiet apartment in San Francisco. The city hummed gently beyond her windows. She was still in the same blazer from the flight, half unbuttoned now, the sleeves wrinkled at the elbows. Her laptop was open in front of her, screen glowing with unread emails and meeting invitations. But she hadn't touched the keyboard. Her phone buzzed beside her. Dozens of missed calls, a message from the board, a text from Sterling Ray. Media requests were flooding in. Interviews, commentaries, offers to appear on national panels about corporate leadership, diversity, systemic equity. Some of it was genuine. Much of it felt opportunistic. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say yet, because the story they wanted was too simple. She could feel it already, the way her strength would be reduced to a quote, her silence interpreted as strategy, her calmness repackaged into a neat bullet point on how to handle public discrimination with grace. But what she had experienced on that plane wasn't a PR moment. It was life. It was decades of knowing how to breathe when someone else decided you didn't belong. She stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the skyline. The early light bathed the buildings in soft gold, not unlike the light on the plane when it all began. She watched the morning unfold, quiet, steady, real. Then she opened her laptop, not to respond, to write, not a press statement, a letter. It began simply. The seat was never just a seat. She paused after the first line. It was a placeholder, a symbol, a territory where power plays out in quiet negotiations and unspoken rules. It was a line drawn not in ink, but in assumption. An assumption that some bodies don't belong in certain spaces, even when they've paid for the right to be there. She continued writing. I've learned, over years of leadership, that power is not the loudest voice in the room. It is the presence that refuses to disappear. It's the decision to stay seated, not in defiance, but in ownership. The words came slowly, but surely, to those watching from the outside. This was not an isolated moment. It was a pattern, interrupted, a glimpse of what happens daily, in boardrooms and schools, in elevators and airplanes. She paused, thinking of Naomi's eyes when she offered that water, of Sterling's steady voice, of the passengers who spoke up. Each of them had stepped beyond comfort and chosen clarity. She wrote on, justice doesn't always look like a courtroom. Sometimes it's a seat in row 3 that you refuse to give up, not because you're stubborn, but because you know who you are, and you're tired of proving it. By the time she finished the letter, the sun had climbed higher. Her inbox was still pinging, but her heart had stilled. She clicked send. The letter went directly to her communications team, to be published as an open message on Ascendair's website. No dramatic press release, no curated campaign, just truth, placed gently in the world, like a stone dropped in still water. By noon, the letter had gone viral. But something unusual happened. People didn't just read it, they paused with it. There were comments online. Yes, debates, arguments, as expected. But there were also long, heartfelt messages from Black women who had never told their stories before, from flight attendants who had quietly witnessed similar moments but felt powerless, from fathers who admitted they hadn't known how deeply these things went. Something had shifted. The story wasn't about Calder anymore. His name had faded into the background, replaced by conversations about proximity, power, and presence. He released a statement, of course, drafted by a legal team, full of the usual platitudes, but no one paid much attention because the world had moved on, and it had moved toward Arielle. In the following weeks, Ascendair launched a new initiative, Seat 3A, a training program for all crew members and executives, focused on unconscious bias, passenger dignity, and real-time intervention strategies. It wasn't just training videos. It was immersive, person-to-person dialogue. Naomi became part of the Leadership Council. Javier helped design the conflict response flow. Sterling Ray took on a new title, Vice President of Justice and Culture, and Arielle. She stayed exactly where she was, in her seat, but something was different now. She no longer had to convince people. She belonged. They saw it. She still walked into rooms where she was the only one like her. Still had to smile when microaggressions were dressed up as compliments. But the weight of invisibility had lifted just enough, because people had seen her stay seated. And they remembered what it meant. Months later, during a leadership summit in Chicago, a young black executive asked her how she had stayed so composed that day. Arielle smiled, folded her hands gently in her lap, and said softly, "Because I've spent a lifetime being asked to move. At some point, you stop explaining. You just stay where you are." The room fell quiet, then applause. But Arielle didn't need it, because the seat was never just about sitting. It was about standing your ground without standing up. It was about holding your worth in spaces not designed for you. And now, finally, the world had begun to shift its design. One flight, one voice, one seat at a time. She never raised her voice. She never stood up. And yet, the entire flight changed, because one woman refused to disappear. Arielle DuPont didn't need applause. She needed the world to see what so many carry quietly every single day, that dignity should never be up for debate. That presence isn't a privilege, it's a right. In a cabin full of silence, she held her ground, and in doing so, she forced everyone to ask, why do we only respect some people once they defend themselves? Why do we demand grace from the harmed and excuses for the powerful? This story is not just about one flight. It's about every boardroom, classroom, and public space where quiet prejudice steals someone's seat, their right to simply be. And it's about what happens when we finally say, no more. To those who've been told they don't belong, we see you. We hear you. We're staying seated with you. If this story stirred something in you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful human stories that challenge the world and change it. More stories are coming, and they matter. So stay with us